Good afternoon. In 2 months, it will be 2 years since the pandemic began, and there doesn't seem to be any end in sight. The effects of COVID go far beyond the risk of getting the disease and having the long-term effects of catching it or even dying from it. COVID has affected our economy, it has affected our social bonds. We see the toll that it is taking on us virtually everywhere. Now, when COVID first hit back in March of 2020, it felt like a crisis. A crisis is literally a short-term, sudden trouble or danger to deal with. But now, after nearly 2 years, it's not so short-term anymore, is it? It is just dragging on. And now COVID is a chronic condition, a long-term or persistent problem, rather than a crisis. It's important for us to realize this distinction because our response to a crisis and our response to a chronic condition are very different. When you're in a crisis, you can just sort of hold your breath and hold on until it's over. You can take some immediate steps to deal with it and then deal with the consequences of it later. In a chronic situation, you have to make plans for the long term, see the big picture. You need to ask yourself how you can sustain yourself in an ongoing way in that current situation. For example, if you're suddenly hit with a major expense like needing to buy a new car, that's a crisis, a financial crisis. So you can figure out in the short term how to get through it. Maybe you'll put some money on your credit card and then you can pay it off later. But it would be very different if instead of having one sudden major expense, you find out that each month you just don't have enough money to cover your bills. That would be a chronic situation that needs a long-term solution. If you treat it like a crisis and just start putting money on your credit card, it won't be long until you are drowning in debt. The same thing is true for how we handle COVID. We hope that it will end, whatever ending means, and we hope it'll happen soon. But we can't count on it. After going through it for such a long time, it may be a permanent feature of our lives. And so individually and as a church, we cannot treat COVID like a crisis anymore. We can't just hunker down in a corner until it's over. We need to find a way to live and thrive in these conditions. And that might mean that we have to make significant changes in how we go about life. That's not what anyone wants, of course. We continue to pray and hope that we will emerge from COVID one way or the other. But the prudent path for us is to seek God's guidance in how to adapt to this new situation. What does it mean to be faithful to God in these conditions? Because they might last. This is very similar to a message that God gave to the prophet Jeremiah to pass along to the exiles in Babylon. At this time, the kingdom of Judah had been overrun by the Babylonians. The capital of Jerusalem was under siege, and many of the people from the country had already been taken away to Babylon. In chapter 29 of his book, Jeremiah sent a letter to those exiles. He told them, build houses and settle down, plant crops, marry, have children. Where you're living now is going to be your home for quite a while. The faithful path of living does not mean keeping your bags packed until the time you're going to be able to come back home to Judah, because that's not going to happen for a long time. I believe that this is the message for us as well. Settle down in this COVID world. Learn how you can live in it, because it's the world you're going to be living in for this foreseeable future. And again, let me emphasize, this is not what we want, but it is also not a cause for hopelessness, because there is another message that Jeremiah included in that letter. And this is a verse of encouragement that people quote many, many times. In that same letter, Jeremiah wrote to them, I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Normally, when we grasp onto the promise of that verse, we're not thinking about the context of it. When we hear about God having plans for us to prosper, that doesn't mean that the prosperous future is right around the corner. In fact, for these exiles in Babylon, Jeremiah told them, you're going to be there for 70 years. So yes, God has a plan for prosperity in the future, but don't sit around and wait for it. Learn how you can thrive in the place where you find yourself right now. A couple chapters later in the letter, the Lord gave Jeremiah another message of hope to sustain him through this chronic situation they were in. The situation, of course, meaning that the Babylonians had conquered their land. God told Jeremiah to buy a field in his hometown from his cousin. Now, at that time, his hometown and the field were in territory that was occupied by the Babylonian Empire. Jeremiah was buying a field that he couldn't even get to, let alone plant crops in. So while he might have been in a chronic situation, he might have been under the Babylonian rule for the long haul, the promise was that there will be an end. Would you pray with me, please? Lord, I think the message for today is a desire for you to give us bifocal vision. A vision, yes, to see how in the long term you will help us prosper, that you do have wonderful plans for us, that the exiles will come home, that Jeremiah will be able to return to that field that he has bought. But help us also recognize, Lord, that for now at least, this is the world that we're living in. So instead of engaging in wishful thinking that things might be different, and hopefully tomorrow it'll all be changed, help us instead, Lord, to watch for the message you have for us right now, so that we can learn what it means to be faithful to you while we continue in the situation we're in now. Amen. Thanks for joining me. We'll talk again later.